So we have a panel on the topic of gender and generation, and I just want to briefly talk about how this came to be. When I was meeting with pastors and therapists for the last several months, a couple things. If you are a therapist, you've often heard in your work with Asian American women the challenges in navigating patriarchy or sexism in all sorts of forms, right? One of the things that was coming up was therapists saying to me, well, I'm not sure I want to go to this networking event or to this conference if what it is a bunch of Asian women therapists serving Asian male pastors, right? Sort of fitting into their ministry. Although there are many ways that there are women in those spaces doing amazing things in great collaborative relationships with male pastors. But many of us know, myself included, and I would say a lot of the women here probably have had countless experiences where you've encountered sexism or patriarchy in your Asian American church context. And Linda kind of even referenced that earlier. So this is something I will just come out and say, I don't know if an Asian male leader would initiate or facilitate this conversation. I will also say it is because this is part of the clinical work I do. I navigate issues of gender and power in couple relationships, so I'm particularly keen on these dynamics. I wanted to share that background because I think this is a significant area of need for healing in the Asian American church at large. Okay. Having said that, I also know a couple things. Fuller Seminary is a space where we ordain women, we value the gifts and talents of women, and it's centered here. Even with that, my invitation to the community to come today, I understand we have a wide range of theologies represented today. So this is not a time where we are saying, this is the right way, this is not at all. What I'm inviting you to tune into are the lived experiences of our pastors here, what their journeys have been like. What is this challenge in you? What comes up, right? Often when we talk about things like race and racism, sex and sexism, lots of discomfort. So I just invite you to attend to it, be curious about it, and be open and willing to listen to the stories of people here today. So I should also disclose, these are my pastors. So my husband and I, we just became members 2 weeks ago after 5 years of being at Evergreen Baptist Church of Los Angeles. It was a long time coming, thanks to Pastor Jonathan, who met with us on a 4 p.m. on a Monday while our kids were at school so that we could go to membership class. So thank you. All right. So without further ado, can you please introduce your church, yourselves, and your roles within your church?
Sure. I'll start. And I have to say, in full disclosure, that all of us are intimidated by the brilliance of Dr. Jessica ChenFeng. So there's mutual respect. I'm Jason Ashimoto. I'm the senior pastor of Evergreen Baptist Church of Los Angeles. I've been attending Evergreen since I was in high school. However, my family started attending there in the 1950s after World War II, and the Japanese community came back to Los Angeles. Our church is 99 years old. So next year we celebrate our centennial. So we anticipate a lot of partying next year with a lot of food. But that sort of presents a very special context for us. We're multi-generational age-wise, and so we have our oldest member, I think, is 99 years old as well. And she's, in good company with a lot of aging congregants in our congregation. Our youngest pre-members are in the womb right now, so that's nice to see as well. But then also we have a multi-generational as far as ethnicity goes as well. So you have the immigrant generation, and then you have my kids that are fifth generation Asian American. And so there's a lot of dynamics in that present itself in our context.
Great, thank you. And yeah, each of your roles. Yeah, thanks, Jason.
Hi, I'm Shirley, and I am the perennial pastor, part-time. And I've been a member of Evergreen since 79. Thank you, dear. Oh, sorry. But in the last 20 years, I've been on staff, serving first as the children's pastor, and then this last 3-4 years as the perennial pastor.
You want to describe what perennial? Because I don't know.
What is perennial?
For trees.
Okay, so when I decided that I wanted to retire, I said, well, I went to Pastor Jason. I said, I want to retire. And he comes back and he says, well, did you think about coming back at part-time? And I said, no, but give me a couple of weeks or months to let me think about this and pray about it. So the reason why he wanted me to come back as a perennial, as a part-time, is so that I can pastor those of us in the congregation who are in denial of being in our 60s. So these are our baby boomer generation, and we are all in denial. So the first order of business was trying to decide what the name of this group is going to be. And first we thought it would be baby boomer deniers. But we came up with a different name, and it's called Joy 50. And Joy stands for just older youth. And you're pretty much, your kids are pretty much done. I mean, you're raising them, and they're done, and you can go out and play it again. So then we talked about what I should have as a title. And I don't like senior ministry because, of course, it's a denial, right? I'm denying that I am a senior. We came up with perennial, which is always growing and continue to grow in our years. So that's where perennial pastor comes with. Oh.
Good morning. I'm Jonathan Wu. Of the four of us, I've been at Evergreen the longest. This coming September would be 30 years. Jason and I knew each other when I first arrived. He was just about finishing high school, and I had the opportunity to come and be an intern at Evergreen. Several years later, I was invited to be one of the associate pastors. And my current position is executive pastor. Basically, it's whatever the senior pastor does not want to do and assigns to me, or if there's need. So, for example, right now our family ministry pastor is on leave, and so for the last year or so, I've been helping out in children's ministry. And so it's been a joy to be able to have this long history working with the previous senior pastor and now with Jason for this past 7 years.
Hi, it's good to see everybody. My name is January, like the month, and I've been at Evergreen since 2019. I've been taking a break from church ministry, wrapping up my time here at Fuller. When I met with Jason, he finally got me on board, and then the pandemic happened, so joke was on me. But I am currently working as a worship arts pastor. Worship arts, meaning we go beyond just the task of directing music. My job actually is to weekly collaborate in the collaboratory with Pastor Jason as well as any other staff to design and produce the order of service every single week. So every Sunday, our gatherings change and look a little bit different. But with that, the arts portion, I get to wrangle a brilliant group of artists to do multiple creative projects a year. So whether that's producing music EPs for Advent or for Lent or for our Joy 50 Plus prime timers, or if it's editorial projects such as our zine, just a little bit of a plug-in, I guess, called Motif Sketchbook. And we like to platform artists, not just in our community, but artists all over in our network as well. So that's kind of my portion as worship arts. I also coordinate with Pastor Jonathan some of our community life ministry things. So I am leading our home group ministry, which is kind of our weekly gathering, what we call our weekly gatherings, and where we continue our spiritual formation that we do on a weekly basis.
Thank you. I have to say, our 3-year-old who has pink-eyed today will request, I want to listen to Pastor January's music and hear her voice. So the EPs that they create make it all the way down to our young members. So you can see here just like the representation, gender and generationally, right? So from your perspectives as our pastors, what have you seen or experienced around gender or generation? And why are these important areas to consider in our well-being as communities? Anything at all?
Yeah, I think, I think our context sort of presents a very special situation for our church, having a lot of variation in our generations ethnically and kind of chronologically too. And so you get a lot of people from different generations. Immigrants, fourth generation, fifth generation. You get our older members, our legacy members. You have young adults, and so there's a lot of dynamic. To me, that's very Asian American. So I think that's why it's so important for us to talk about this. It's kind of a hallmark of our church where people value the different generation, the variety of generations within our context. I feel like for some churches, maybe you would go to them because they have a really great program. For us, I feel like they come because there's a lot of generational variety in the congregation. People come because they're like, oh, it feels like my dysfunctional family back home. Hopefully without some of the dysfunction, maybe with other dysfunction, but I think people, they find comfort in that they have this faith community that they can see in our older members their grandparents, and they can see in the younger members their nephews and nieces and children themselves.
I think most of us here got to grow up in the Asian American church context. And so I do know that we carry some of that history, maybe some of that baggage as we think about the issue of gender and generations. I grew up in the Midwest and grew up in a Chinese immigrant church. And so obviously there, in that context, there was high respect for your elders. All of our leaders were the men in the church. And so as a young person, obviously it formed certain images of what leadership looked like. And even generationally, who commended wisdom, who commended the ear to listen to. And so I think, obviously, as I've been privileged to be a part of the Evergreen family for 30 years, I've seen myself grow just because of the expansiveness of the church life. And so even grateful, even as I'm extremely grateful for my beginning and for who I was back then, I'm also equally grateful for who I've become since coming out to Evergreen.
I also think it's important, right? Because it just is so prevalent, right? And if as a church, we're really seeking to be a sanctuary or a safe place or even a subversive place to combat the daily things that we face as women of color, daily things that we face as queer people, daily things that we face even as religious people, devoted people, I think there is an important aspect of naming those things, naming patriarchal issues, kind of like our Grace Life siblings did, or even dealing with the fact that we still struggle with it as a church. It's so important to name that so that we can begin to heal together and excavate in a very personalized local church sort of way. Like, what do we need to do to heal from these things and address these things so that we can indeed be a home for others then from the outside to come in? That we're not just prescribing teaching, but we're embodying the healing and the safety of all that.
Yes, there are times when I first started coming to Evergreen, let me back up. I grew up in a very traditional Chinese immigrant church as well. So when we were looking for a church, I didn't want to go to any of those churches. And Evergreen at that time was becoming a very, just mostly English speaking, which is what we were looking for. So when I first started first attending Evergreen, I was amazed by the older generation that was already there. And mind you, at that time, they were in their 40s. So I've kind of grown up with them. But what they presented for us, for my husband and I, an example of how to serve, and their wisdom in their spiritual journey that was passed down to us. Not just the spiritual journey, but also the parenting parenting advice. So that's why the intergenerational thing is so important. I remember when I was visiting my daughter in one of her first churches that we went to, I was looking around and my husband and I were the only ones that were older, okay? The second time we came, she says, Mom, there are older people now here. And I said, oh, how old is old? Oh, they're in their 50s. So, but it was very good. It was heartwarming for me to see that, because then they were, what I saw was that these older generation, these 50-year-olds, was still respecting what the ministry was going on in that particular church, even though it was a young church. But yeah, so the intergenerational aspects of church is very important.
A quick thing that just came to my mind, if you remember the Dr. Thompson's commentary on John 10:10, like it feels like this abundant life, right? Which is the past in the present and sort of the intergenerational blessing and flourishing that can happen because of these generations together. Yeah. I'm not necessarily going in order, but I think it would be helpful to talk about maybe first personal journeys around gender and generation, like why did you come to become aware of these things as variables, identities in our lives? And then after that, we can talk about maybe the journey Evergreen has gone through. Yeah.
I don't always have to start.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Yeah, growing up in the Midwest, I definitely had a sense of a struggle of who I was. You know, I did lived in a sort of a schizophrenic life. In the weekends, I would be down in Chicago, Chinatown, going to the Chinese church, playing sports with other Chinese youth. And a weekday, I would be living in the suburbs, being one of the very few minorities. And so I wrestle with what does it mean to be an Asian young person, male. And so growing up, obviously, you look up to your father and you think about, okay, how do I want to emulate him? As I hit my adolescence, how do I not want to be like him? Became part of the reality. And so there was definitely some tensions that I was experiencing. It was partly reinforced, and this was much later in terms of my own self-awareness. I'm the oldest son in my family. My father is also the oldest son in his family. And so within sort of my family lineage, there was this implicit sort of expectations of who I was. Recently I was, our family decided to have a family reunion back in the Midwest. And I told my mom I can't make it. And she says, oh, why aren't you going? You're the oldest grandson. And so it was just a reminder, even as I'm now 60, of some of the history that still is embodied in my family story, which I sometimes am not cognizant of, but there are other times it's very real for me. And so even as I've been grateful that God has broadened my perspective and understand more of who I am as a person, how I am as a husband and father and a pastor at Evergreen, I know that there's still part of that story that's still being worked through. But Evergreen has been a fantastic place for me to grow from that early beginning, which I'm very grateful for, to really reflect on who God wants me to be in terms of shepherd for the congregation. For me personally, in terms of gender, some of the most specific and meaningful experiences was when I was in campus ministry to have my immediate supervisor be an Asian American woman. First time I've ever had a person of that stature present in my life and really shaped who I was as a person. And so that even precursed my coming to Evergreen. And then coming on the staff and having my first pastoral supervisor be another woman. And then to have colleagues like January and Shirley and others over the years, I think has been part of the healing transformational process for me.
Yeah, I'm a second gen Korean American. So for every time somebody says, I really wanted to leave the Korean church and we should just put $1 for the cookie fairy to come because we can all use another cookie fairy, I think. So my dad is a pastor. My grandfather was a pastor. My uncle is still a pastor. My aunt got ordained last year. There's too many, I think, but I'm pursuing my ordination, right? And so I've grown up within the Korean immigrant church. That's my context. And so in terms of patriarchy, in terms of sexism, in terms of ageism in general, that is very much prevalent, I think, in the DNA that is running deep, deep inside me. And so I always say, like, you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? There's such beauty in honoring, respecting your elders. There's such beauty in recognizing the differences between men and women and the different strengths that we carry. And there's also a lot of toxic damage done, especially within an immigrant church that's trying to preserve all that we know. Right? Because there's a lot of survival instinct in there. And so I think I was privy to much of that in my early spiritual formation. And even outside of that, going to sometimes second generation Korean American churches that still exists. And that's okay. And there's a lot of specific healing that's being done in these specific places, right? And so for me, I think the realization, the aha moment was very recently, or I guess last year, when my mom's mom passed away. My grandma had passed away. My mom's, again, having been that immigrant pastor's wife, we call her 사모님, right? She was 사모님 all her life. She was a caretaker for the last 20 years for my grandmother. My grandmother has severe dementia. So she was the breadwinner because my dad was always part of this smaller church. She was my tiger mom, so my tutor, my life, my savior, my God, in all the healthy and unhealthy ways. And then she was the pastor's wife, dutifully doing all the background work. She was a pianist, or she was a piano accompanist. And then now she was a nurse, right? And when my grandmother passed away, instead of grieving, I saw her working in the kitchen to feed everybody else that was going to grieve. And I realized there was this aha moment of like, there's such beauty in that. And then there's something in me that wants to tell her to rest. And I want to embody that for myself. I want to embody that for the future generations to come, right? That there is a balance. There is a healthy way to conserve culture, respect your culture, and still live a life where you can find rest, you can find validation, and you can actually receive kudos for all the work that you've put in. And so I feel like my duty as at a church like Evergreen, or even just simply as an associate pastor, is to embody that. How can I respect my elders and love on them the way that I was taught? And at the same time, create new spaces and regenerate these values in a way that feels actually validating and worthy to myself, because, hey, I might actually deserve that.
I grew up in, as I mentioned before, a Chinese traditional immigrant church, and my parents are first gen. I'm so. So the context that I would grew up in is very patriarchal, because not only in the Chinese culture, and in the Chinese church, but also because of the denomination that my dad was part of. So when I was growing up, I didn't see that many female church leaders on staff or anything like that. So but there were women in the congregation who were very, very strong. And I remember every Sunday afternoon after church, about 6 o'clock in the evening, we would get a phone call from this one woman who was very, very, very opinionated, very opinionated. And she would call my dad and tell him what went wrong, what he did wrong. And this would go on for an hour on the phone. Yeah, a landline phone. And I remember thinking, wow, this is what church is like. I don't know if I want to be part of it. But so that was one example. And then I also saw my mom as a PW, right? Pastors' wives are always, as you said, they're doing everything. But what my mother also did was, she was a very strong woman to begin with, because she had to raised 2 children on her own until they were like 8 and 9 years old. So before she came to the States. So She was a single mom for for a lot of those first years. So I saw her grow as an immigrant from not learning English and not knowing how to cook to being able to serve this great meal whenever guests came to the house. So from her, I realized that I can do anything, whether it's part of serving in ministry or teaching. Um, so, but she also told me, she told all of my sisters and I, don't ever marry a pastor. So that was in the back of our minds. One sister did marry a pastor. I married a guy who told me he was not going to seminary, but ended up going to seminary. And I kept asking him the whole time he was in seminary, are you going to become a pastor? And he kept saying no. And I said, well, you better not. But then I answered a call to be on staff.
Perennial pastor.
Yeah. So when the title of pastor was given to me, a lot of the staff people asked me, so what do you think about having the title? And what would your dad think because of his background in not validating women in ministry? And I said, well, he's probably rolling over his grave. But whether he would be proud, I don't know. I know my mother would be. Yeah. Because for her, no matter what you did, you had to be a strong woman. So, yeah.
I think your dad would be proud. I have to, I'm going to just comment on Shirley. Shirley's run away from her calling from the time I've known her. And it took the community to come around her and say, like, you're a pastor, right? And she continues to run, but I feel like God continues to follow her. So everybody around you thinks of you much more highly than yourself. I think for me, my context, my dad worked a lot traveling when I was small. So big influences in my life were my mother and grandmother. I know how to coupon and grocery shop much better than my wife, and she will attest to that. I don't let her go to the grocery store. I'm like, you don't know how to do it. I know how to do it. But my mother and grandmother were huge influences on me. I feel like a large part of who I am are because of them. So I feel like I've had really positive role models, female role models in my life. And I came to faith, even though my family had been, like my mother grew up at Evergreen until she was in college. But I grew up not going to church, just sort of hearing about Jesus, stories about Jesus from my grandmother and mother. And then in high school, I started going to church. And so when I stepped into church and came to faith, I didn't have sort of this really set in stone idea of like all pastors have to be male. I think that maybe helped me because as I stepped into the community at Evergreen, a couple years, maybe 2 years after that, the church hived, and my predecessor, Reverend Dr. ChenFeng, he became the senior pastor, and immediately he made the church affirming of women in ministry. And so our youth pastor switched from our old youth pastor, who was male, went with our other congregation, and then he hired a female to be the youth pastor at that point. Amongst the leaders, the Reverend Melanie Marchow, Pastor Shirley. I feel like I grew up with these people. I was an intern. Part of my internship was under Pastor Shirley. So I think that I really value that experience, that there are a lot of positive female role models around me that I think has helped shaped the normalcy of having a diverse staff in terms of gender.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks to all of you. I love learning these things about, my own pastors. One of the things I'm hearing is, first of all, the the number of women in your personal and ministry lives that you had the opportunity to like learn from, receive from, be taught by, be shaped by, that's key. There's something about that. The modeling gets internalized. The other thing I'm curious about is because we can be in a church where, let's say, denominationally, it ordains women, right? And there can be a very different relational dynamic that doesn't necessarily align with that, right? So, for example, and it may not be even around like who's preaching or who's doing this leading, but it can be in the very subtle ways that men talk to women, right? How you treat boys and girls. It's in the culture of the church. And so I mentioned that to ask, I know at Evergreen, this is part of our life, our culture. We affirm women in ministry. How about, and I know it's different for you, Jason, in the sense that you've sort of grown up in this church, but each of your observations around how does the life of Evergreen, whether you take it to mean theology, your personal relationships across genders, how does it feel distinctly different in our community life? Maybe, and I don't like to do things like verses, but like in contrast to other spaces that you've been a part of. What about Evergreen's culture around gender and generation has added to your healing, to your growth, to your transformation because of this attention to gender and generation? Yeah.
It's a really easy question to answer. I think the best way to answer that, and thank you for observing that, is just to describe a little bit my working relationship with Pastor Jason, right? Because if you go to an Asian American church and I don't think, Jason, you actually share your title is senior pastor, Jason Ashimoto. So you expect that the senior pastor, takes care of the vision. He's like the overseer of the entire church, essentially, and he kind of is like top down. Everything's top down. Although we just heard about a less top down, form of ministry at Grace Life, right? But I really think that my relationship with Jason, the way that we deal with our Sunday services, it's so unusual. It's unnatural. Almost, right? And so what it is when you think about worship arts pastor, you usually think every Sunday you're in charge of 4 different songs. The pastor tells you what they're going to preach on. There's like a set liturgy and you're like going to manage the tech and the musicians. And that's plenty of work enough as it is. And so kudos to everyone who's doing that in this room, right? When Jason hired me, I was like, I can't do that because that will bore me. And as a creative person, I will leave you within 3 months. And I guarantee you that's going to be on ink. So if you want that for 3 months, great, right? And Jason was like, and this is to his anointing, he recognized that from the get-go anyway. And he was like, actually, I'd love for you to be more creative with the process. And I was able to recognize a fellow artist in Jason. And he would never say actually how good of an artist he is, but every week we get together and we ideate. And we germinate, and we just kind of throw out seeds of ideas for worship. By this, I mean different original prayers. I mean different moments of media production, of news bites, of visuals, of art that we can focus on, of songs which lyrics we might subvert because those lyrics can be offensive to some in the room and not be inclusive. We're talking about even in terms of how we rotate the pulpit. Who's going to lead, the intentionality of who's going to lead this Mother's Day prayer? How are we going to talk about this panel that we had about patriarchy? Who's going to host it? What are the 3 voices that we need to hear? There's so much intentionality. And Jason, for the most part, is doomed to listening to me ideate. For the most part, he's like sitting there and be like, oh yeah, and I'm just like, what about we? And then we do, and then we do, and then what do you? And he's like, great, yeah, no, I support that. And I think that is unheard of. I know that's unheard of. For a senior pastor to allow for the associate pastor to call almost all the shots every single Sunday, where usually the senior pastor as a male gets the most attention, is a lot of that 45 minutes, maybe a little less now, hopefully, because it's pandemic, right? It's unheard. That kind of collaboration and that kind of mixing and matching of recognizing my giftings as an artist, but also holding me, reining me in when he feels like I can be too offensive. Like there are these beautiful ways I think that we mix and match. And that has been healing. To know that a position like this can exist for somebody like me in the church, where I thought that I was doomed. I can never come back to the church as an artist.
Well, if it's okay, January, some of the things I hear under that is almost like your shock, surprise, and delight, because internally you assumed there were boundaries to your pastorship, right? Like,
Say more, yeah.
yeah, you assumed that, like, and I think this is the case for a lot of women, right? You only went so far in that dynamic, and so you imagine in working with this Asian male, this is my limit. This is the ends of my ability to influence another, and at the end of the day, he'll decide. But you're just like, this is new and different, and it happens every week. That's awesome. Thanks.
Pastor Jason, feel free to disagree, by the way.
Our collaborations, because I just need a lot of help. I'm like, I don't know what I'm going to do this week, January. What are we going to do?
And for the rest of us, it's when January says we have to do it, we end up doing it. There's no volunteer.
Remind us, Jessica, what's the question again? I apologize.
You know what? I've sort of lost track of it myself. I'm also attending to the time. I'm thinking about, it was distinguishing between, okay, those of you familiar with the like DEI term, right? You have diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is like representation. You've got women who are pastors, right? But what about the relational patterns that allow for true inclusion? Are voices centered? Are women's opinions listened to, valued, celebrated, esteemed, right? Like that's a different level. And so there are many ways that patriarchy, we might have the representation, but is it a mutual dynamic across genders, right? So I guess my curiosity was the life you have as co-leaders at Evergreen, how has it been healing for you? And so that was, January's really beautiful articulation of that. But I think it's also helpful to hear from men, right? Like what's important to state, I mean, there's a lot of people I'm sure here who study these things. Patriarchy does not only hurt women, it hurts all genders, right? It takes away men's capacity to be in authentic mutual relationship with others as well. So in a space where there's this mutuality and collaboration, we assume and trust that it brings healing to all people. So that was my question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, I think what grew out of maybe a lack of self-confidence in myself, just having so many diverse voices on our staff has been really helpful for the church. People always come up and say like, "Oh, I love it. I love when you don't preach and your staff preaches," because they value just the diversity of voices and all the stories and the way that everybody else sees faith. I think I recognize that in talking to people, how many people in our congregation have valued having women in the pulpit, and just young women seeing role models in some of our even some of our former pastors that have come through our church. I think for me, it allows, I think, a healing space for me because it redefines what I hold myself to be as a male. And I feel like I don't have to live up to a lot of the stereotypes that have been imposed upon me. Like, I have to talk about the Lakers every week or whatever in my sermon. Like I can truly be who I am. And so it's a very liberating space, I think, as a male as well. Also, as a senior pastor, it's great to have the variety of voices, because then not only does the congregation get a variety of perspectives about faith, but I can rest a little bit more which makes the whole church healthier if the senior pastor is rested. So that it's just a wonderful environment, I think, for me to work, even as a male pastor.
Can I highlight something you said, Jason, which is really important? At least this is what I heard. Um, Men, Asian men, also internalize these gender discourses, right? Like, what are the expectations? What do you have to live up to? What is your role in the family? What's your role as senior pastor? And it's all these ideas of like what it's supposed to look like. And what you're saying is there are parts of me that don't align with whatever that was supposed to look like. And there can be an internalized pressure, right? It could be burnout, it lead to burnout, all these sorts of depression, anxiety. But to have a space where you can be who God has made you to be, access those giftings, release the other ones to other people that belong to them. That's what I'm hearing from you as an Asian male. That's really awesome. Yeah.
There have been very times during staff meeting, we'll be going over what the sermon series will be about. And so Jason will throw out the topics and then he'll say, well, what, does any of these topics, interest you? Of course, none of it interests me. So, but in the course of this discussion of what the topic is about, I'll have some God speaking through me, and I'll say it, and then he'll look at me and he'll go, "That sounds like a sermon for you." And I said, I'll look at him and go, "No, thank you." But I have to say that the setup. The fact that my voice is being, even with just that little comments or anything like that, is all validated now. Whereas before, when I was on under the other senior pastor, I mean, he was great in just affirming the fact that I was on staff, but I was not. I was a little intimidated about voicing those points. So, discussion would be talking, and I go, ooh, that's an idea. And then I don't say it because I didn't think it was important. But with Jason and with the rest of the staff, I've been able to have that space to say, and feel comfortable and safe. So,
yeah. Thank you, Shirley. Sorry, the therapist that's process-oriented in me feels the need to make comments. I also want to highlight with what you just said, Shirley, is that I think the majority of women, especially Asian American women, carry a lifetime of relationships where you're always self-censoring or you never sense that it's the right time or it's okay to volunteer your perspective unless you're invited or asked or told, right? I'm sure all the people who are faculty here, that happens with your students, lots of nodding in the room. So in a ministry context, I think, especially for men, the intentionality men have to put forth to on purpose ask, to realize I should assume most of my women colleagues, this has been their experience. What can I do differently to allow them to feel like before I ask that they get to a place they can just tell me, right? That is real mutuality. Yeah. Anything else?
Jess, I know that we are a little bit probably running short on time. Can I just point a little bit sidebar off a little bit and talk a little bit also about children's ministry and the kind of impact of kind of like flipping that around a little bit. Just because she's here, our worship arts coordinator, Mide, is here, and she works very closely with me, I'm so sorry, to design these services. And we make it a very big part of our regular gathering rhythm to feature our children. And oftentimes when we think about children's ministry being involved, we think, oh, we're going to listen to them sing, we're going to take out our phones, it's going to be so cute. And we do that, right? It's the hypest moment of our service, really. But I think for 2 points to that. One, Pastor Jonathan shared that he's been kind of covering for our family ministries. And he is, with all due respect, the eldest of our group here, seated and featured. And during Christmas, a lot of the cameras went from the children to Pastor Jonathan, who was leading our worship, body worship, because his spinning, his arm movements, it was so amazing.
Don't look at YouTube, please.
Yeah, it was just so beautiful and amazing to watch. Again, the eldest person on our staff leading the youngest person, the youngest worshiping congregant of our church, embodying that, literally embodying that. Oh, I moved as I'm sharing this. So that was one thing I wanted to know of this intergenerational blessing and what Jonathan, by not teaching, but by embodying, showed what worship was all about. Right? Second note is there was this one practice that Mide had thought up. And we had brought the children in and we wanted to have a more extended time of worship together. And so she brought up this beautiful idea of cloud watching. What would it be in our sanctuary to turn it into a park? So we dimmed the lights and we flashed some imageries of clouds, right? And we invited all the adults and our children to shout out whatever they saw. And I don't know, I grew up in a church where children were expected to stay quiet, right? The house of Jesus was to remain holy and reverent. But these kids were screaming so, dinosaur! It was like really intense. And some of this, kids, honestly, you're like, who's, they need some parenting, but it's fine. Like, who is that? And the point I want to make is these kids, the 7-year-old child is going to start to remember their Evergreen sanctuary as if it was Disneyland, as if it was a park. That it's not just a scary place to worship a God that's invisible, but it's a place where you could imagine, where you could laugh, you could even scream, and their parents are not going to say anything because it was a worship arts coordinator and pastor who gave them permission to do so. And I want to say that we were shaped. It wasn't the kids. Their kids were going to be, I'm praying, are going to be permanently shaped by that moment, but we were shaped. Our congregants were shaped by that moment because we realized how fun and buoyant and jubilous our worship could be. And there was no bounds to it that we could experience an amusement park inside our sanctuary.
Thank you, January. So much I can say as a fellow parent with 2 young kids. The many times I felt apologetic for my children's loudness, their quote unquote disruptive behavior, but always met with empathy and grace and understanding from parented pastors, from non-parented, like no different. And so like, it's such a gift. Yeah. I want to ask, I know we had other questions, but for the sake of time, is there anything you feel like you want to share with this community in terms of, what's at stake? What's something you want to mention before, we close out our platform?
I think as the OG on the staff, what I've been very appreciative, and one of the reasons I've been at Evergreen as long as I have is it's been definitely a grace-filled and generous community. I think that oftentimes when you're in ministry, you feel like, you're just waiting for the time to go. But I don't think that I've ever felt that so distinctly that I would turn my back. And I have to consider that's part of the amazing spirit of Evergreen. Not that I can compare with anyone else because I've been there so long, but I think that as I recognize the different generations that have modeled faith to me in my years at Evergreen, and now the opportunity to see the younger generations do the same, I know that it's been a lot of long effort and faith. The quality of people that have come and brought who they are, their full person to the church. I'm still deeply moved by the amazing giftings that we have at our church, not only on the paid staff, but our volunteers. And the energy of Evergreen is really born through the people. And I think that's what sustains me as a pastor. If I felt that the future and the vitality of the church is dependent upon me, then that's foolishness. But I think that that's been one piece of insight that I've appreciated, especially as I've recognized the different seasons our church has been in. God places in each church an amazing source of blessing and goodness. I appreciate what was said earlier, goodness and beauty and glory. And how can we as pastors step out of the way so that more of that can come out? I think that's really the fullness of the church life, that, we need to be the people that they don't have to ask permission for to do things, but really be the ones that will bless and affirm even as they step forward.
One of the things about Evergreen is that it is English, all English speaking. And our seniors, our legacy seniors, are of second and third generation, Niseis and Sanseis. So that makes a difference between, what you see if in an immigrant bilingual congregation, right? So that is a major difference. And being part of Evergreen and seeing that generation as well as the baby boomer deniers, the legacy, as Pastor Jonathan said, is the legacy that we've learned from them, and then to be able to see the new life that is in children's ministry, and to be able to see the integration of all of that come together in service is really really a gift. It really is.
I'll let Jason have the last word, but really quickly, I just want to say diversity is very difficult, but it's very, very beautiful, and it's so worth it. And I feel like as somebody who's in charge of scheduling people who get to be on stage, who share their giftings, it is really important how many men or women are on your worship team. It is really important to see who's leading which liturgy and the flow of the entire service. It's super important to see, are most of your board members men? Right? And it is really important. We haven't touched on it at all, but we went on a very long, arduous journey with queer inclusion. And it's very important to host these stories of being different and coming from different places so that we can land not on the same page in terms of ideology, but landing on the same page of let's try to make effort because it's worth it. Because that's going to be the only way that people keep coming out to church. You know what I mean? So I think it's worth the fight, and it's inevitably very, very difficult.
Can I say two things?
Yes,
Okay.
of course.
Sorry, January, you did hit on it. I want to say it's not just the women in our church that I think create a liberating space for straight males like me, but our queer people as well. I feel like they've helped me to understand who I am as a straight male in a really beautiful way. And so I think just the diversity of the congregation that God has brought together at Evergreen really helps me to understand and discover who I am. Second of all, I think our church's history has been a blessing to me because there's so much that's inherited. I feel like I get to be this pastor of a congregation that went through Japanese American incarceration, carry that story through to today. And I'm really looking at, as Evergreen turns 100 next year, how do I help create a community for the next 100 years, for not just my daughters, but all of our great grandkids and great nephews and great nieces. And so I think that helps me have a really long-term look at how does this family legacy continue to grow and evolve and mature into this more and more beautiful space, because I think we still have, even though we try to be inclusive of so many people, we still have a lot of work to do. But I think doing it together is really fun and really rewarding.
Thank you all so much. So let's say thank you to these pastors.